Ya Alimadat, and good evening. My name is Rehana Varani, and I am the Communications Officer in the Department of Communications and Development at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. I am delighted to introduce this evening's book launch event, which is being held in partnership with ITREB UK. This evening's event will be a discussion of Ismaili Festivals' Stories of Celebration with my colleague and author of the book, Dr. Shiraz Kabani, and host Nina Hirji Kheraj. Dr. Kabani is head of the Department of Community Relations at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, a social scientist by academic training, and a doctorate in management. He has served in various senior leadership roles across the Ismaili community institutions, including the Ismaili Council for the United Kingdom and ITREB USA. In addition to the book we are launching tonight, he has also authored a chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Islamic Ritual and Practice on the Ismailis, history, doctrines, and ritual practices, as well as one on leadership lessons from the life of the prominent pioneer of rural development, Shoaib Sultan Khan, for an edited volume entitled Great Muslim Leaders, Lessons for Education. In his capacity as an alwais for nearly 40 years, Dr. Kabani has engaged extensively with Ismaili audiences across more than 20 countries worldwide. Nina Hirji Kheraj is an award-winning film producer. She has 3 postgraduate degrees in producing for film and television and Muslim cultures from AKU ISMC and in the politics of the contemporary Middle East. Nina's academic interest in Muslims in contemporary Western contexts is accompanied by a strong urge to conceive and produce creative collaborations. She produced and co-created the photographic exhibition Rays of Light, produced the Sufi music concert A Mystical Journey, and more recently conceived and produced Maulana Hazar Imam's 80th birthday celebrations. The format of this evening's event will be a moderated discussion, a musical performance from our lovely singers Inayat and Saima, and an audience Q&A to cap the evening. It is my pleasure to introduce to you once again Shiraz and Nina for what promises to be a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to extend and reiterate Rehana's welcome to those of you who are able to join us today at the Ismaili Centre in London. So, we are here to talk about this new publication that comes from the IIS. And I have to say, Dr. Kabani, Shiraz, that when I picked up this book, it did not say IIS to me. I can see the logo, but it is light, it is very bright, it's very accessible, it has short chapters, it has lots of pictures, it has an accessibility in its text, which doesn't necessarily talk to me about a very heavy academic publication. It feels like a departure. Can you tell us something about what this book is?
Sure, and thank you, and welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. The Institute of Ismaili Studies established in 1977, and so it has engaged in scholarship for the last 30, 40 years. And much of that scholarship was captured in publications which were primarily meant for academic audiences. But it was important that we synthesize that scholarship and make it accessible in a language for the non-specialist audience, people who don't have backgrounds in Islamic studies, people who don't know Arabic and are not familiar with all the terminology. And so there were 2 series of publications that have emerged as a result. One is the World of Islam series, which is also meant to be accessible. But that is more for a general audience. You know, it is available on Amazon for anybody in the world to access. And based on the Imam's guidance, the view was that there ought to be one series of publications that is specifically addressed to the Jamat. You know, we are a family, right? And so we use a particular language within the family. And we assume certain things within the family. And so there had to be publications that could be addressed specifically to the Jamaat in a language that the Jamaat will be able to relate to, with the assumptions that we make in our conversations. And so that's where the Living Ismaili Traditions series has emerged. We've got the general editor of the series here, Dr. Shenul Jiwa. And this is the first book as part of that series. And we wanted to make sure that it had not just the content that was accessible, but it had a look and feel that was accessible. So I must say that I shouldn't take any credit for the design of the work. It is Dr. Shenul Jiwa, we've got Tara Wulno, we've got Raisa, all of whom contributed to its design. By the way, this cover that looks rather colorful, people often ask to say, what is this? Where did you come up with it? It's actually the decorations were done for the Diamond Jubilee of Maulana Hazar Imam, decorations at the Hyderabad Jamat Khana in India. And so we thought that what could be better than have an image that comes from a Jamaat Khana, from the Jubilee of the Imam, reflecting the celebrations and the stories of the Jamaat. So that's why it doesn't look like an IIS book, but it is an IIS book.
So it's for a non-specialist audience,
Indeed.
but I suspect that means that it still retains all of the academic rigor that you would expect of an IIS publication. So I noted that, of course, you reference heavily throughout the book, and that you also allow entry into primary sources. And so for those who have a deeper interest in that, there are ways in which to access that. Yeah. So it's a first book of the Living Tradition series. It's also the first book that you are publishing with IIS. And it seems highly unusual for a first book by a scholar to be in an area that is outside of their academic discipline. Now, your doctoral studies was in management. This is very far away from that academic study. How did this book come about?
So most members of the Jamaat probably know me as an Alwais. I've been in Alwais now just about 40 years. And many years ago, one of the governors of the institute, Wazir Zohar Mekji, he suggested that these oral discourses that I'm used to in the Jamaat, that they reach a very small audience, and that I should find a way to document them so that they can reach a wider audience. And so when this Living Ismaili Tradition series came into being and the first book on the festivals was recommended, I thought that that was a great opportunity to articulate some of these thoughts that I have been communicating to the Jamaat through various discourses. And the festivals allowed me 10 different angles from which I could make these ideas available to the Jamaat. You know, from my perspective, being an Ismaili is more about the way we think than certain beliefs that we hold in our heads. And in my travels from Afghanistan to America, I find this consistency of thought that Ismailis think in a particular way. You will often notice that Ismailis don't ask questions about how to do certain things, but they will ask you, why do we do these things? You see, this is part of an Ismaili way of thinking. And I thought that this was a brilliant opportunity to communicate that way of thinking that at least I have learned in my own way, through the guidance of the Imam, through interaction with the community. And the other thing is that when I traveled and met members of the Jamaat in different parts of the world, there are certain questions that every member of the Jamaat asks. Young and old, rural and urban, America to Afghanistan. And I thought that at least I could share some of my thoughts, some of my reflections on those questions, provide some resources, identify some sources, so that if nothing else, those members of the Jamaat who have the same questions might reflect on those sources and arrive at their own conclusions. They may not agree with the responses that I have cited, but at least it is a way forward in sharing that thinking. So that's how this book came about.
So actually, it's bringing together all your many skills in order to be able to produce this book. Thank you. So on the one hand, you talk about Ismailis having a way of thinking, and yet we're also a very diverse community globally. You situate in your book the historical contexts of each of the festivals, so we have an entry point to that. But you also then expound the understanding of that festival through your very own personal experiences of that festival. Text and author cannot be separated. And you are a South Asian male who had spent his formative years in Pakistan. To what extent does this book include or exclude members from other cultural traditions?
So look, we are all products of our past, our upbringing, the culture in which we are brought up, the language that we speak. And so I'm a product of the South Asian culture. And in that sense, this book clearly reflects my upbringing and my South Asian heritage. And I've repeatedly mentioned that in the book. But also through my experiences with Jamats in different parts of the world, I spent a lot of time in projects in Tajikistan, for example. I actually learned Farsi to be able to communicate with people in that part of the world. That I've tried to draw on those experiences, but again, it is through the South Asian lenses that I wear.
Yes.
I've tried to capture some of their stories. I got a lot of help from individuals who belong to the other traditions of our Jamat. And they helped identify some of the stories. They helped to identify some of the poems, some of the songs, some of their festivities, which I've tried to reflect. But I cannot do justice to that because I don't belong to that tradition. And so the hope is that the image that I've started to draw through this book will start to get completed by other books that are emerging. I mean, already there are books in the pipeline looking at the northern areas of Pakistan and the tradition of the Jamaat that has developed there. There is another work already being developed for the Jamats of Iran. And so as these works emerge, they bring their stories, their ideas, their poems, their poetry, that this picture will start to get completed and the Jamaat will see a reflection of themselves in these works, inshallah.
I think what's also interesting, actually, is when we think of who we are and where we come from, we are not just a cultural tradition. You are not just a South Asian who had his formative years in Pakistan. You are a product of all of these experiences. But also, there is surely a similarity amongst traditions, which, when we think only in terms of binary terms, as if cultures are hermetically sealed, then we do ourselves and others injustice. And I suppose the reason I asked that question, it was a bit of a trick question actually, is I have a personal interest in how cultures come together and then the liminal space between cultures, but then the overlap between cultures, because we are porous. And I suspect that those who don't have a South Asian background when they read this book will also be reading it from the lens of being an Ismaili, as you said earlier. We have called this book Ismaili Festivals. Yes. And so whether you're South Asian or from another tradition, access to those festivals, the right to celebrate those festivals, the right to own those festivals is because we are all Ismailis.
Absolutely.
And you had mentioned that this book is not for a general audience. It is specifically for an Ismaili audience. So that means this book is not available for purchase anywhere other than within the Jamati institutions?
That is correct, yeah. So you will not find it on Amazon.com.
You will not find it. So contact your nearest ITREB distributor. Okay. So speaking of cultures, you have 10 chapters. You alluded to those. Each chapter picks up a different festival. I found it very curious that you started the book with a festival which is more closely associated with being a cultural celebration rather than a religious one. So Nowruz is celebrated by some Muslims around the world, but it is not a Muslim festival. And in reading the book, I understood that, in fact, as Ismailis, it was only during the Fatimid period that Nowruz began to have an Ismaili religious lexicon. Can you tell us why you started with this? Out of all of the festivals that you could have started in a book that's called Ismaili Festivals, you started with one that was so broad.
So this was not the first chapter I wrote, actually. Okay. The first chapter I wrote was the one on Eid al-Adha. But once we had written all the chapters, we had to rationalize how we organize these chapters. How do you put it in a book that makes sense? Because these festivals don't appear in sequence, because some are based on the lunar Hijri calendar, some are based on the solar calendar, so they kind of keep shifting. And so what we thought is that we would start with a festival that is most broadly celebrated. I remember reading a UN report that suggested that more than 300 million people in the world celebrate Nowruz, and goes well beyond the Muslim world. And we thought that we'll start with this sort of a universally celebrated festival, which is also a Muslim festival, but not just a Muslim festival. Then we get to those festivals that are celebrated by the vast majority of Muslims. We've got Miladun Nabi, Eid al-Adha, Eid al-Fitr, and so on. Then we get to the festivals that are specific to the Shia communities. Eid al-Gadir, Yawm Ali, and so on. And the last two chapters have to do with festivals that are specific to our Jamat, Salgira of the Imam and the Imamat Day. But I wrote these chapters to stand independently, in the sense that I've tried to minimize links between the chapters. So you don't have to read it in a sequence. You could dip into this book from any chapter. So if you want to read a chapter because there's a festival coming up, you wouldn't miss a beat. You'll be able to read that chapter and understand that chapter on its own without having to read the rest of the book.
Yes, yes. And actually, I did think, even though I've read the book more than once now, that I would continue to use it as a reference in the run-up to festivals. I also noticed that in engaging with the festivals, the understanding of the historical references of the festivals, that actually it certainly deepened my relationship with those festivals. I suddenly thought, oh, actually, this is very meaningful. I must pay attention to this, participate in this, attend Jamat Khana, understand what this actually means. And so I can see myself going back and forth to this. So we see that there was a structure and a rationale. You went from the general and the shared to the more specific. You use a technique in your book which is based on storytelling.
Yes.
Right? We mentioned earlier that you use stories to situate the festivals in their historical context, but you also, through your personal experiences, share more about the richness of these festivals. They get translated in that way into a lived contemporary context, so not just deep-root historical context, but also how we're experiencing today. Which means, for me at least, that tradition is not fixed, that we are living tradition today, we are creating tradition today, we're engaging with it today in new ways, evolving ways, which I suppose makes sense given this series is called Living Traditions. But you use stories as a technique. And can you tell us, as an educator, what the role of storytelling is in imparting knowledge?
So part of it is an occupational hazard. And otherwise has to tell stories. But we are all storytellers. It's in our DNA. Humans by nature are storytellers. That's how we make sense of the world around us. The earliest cave drawings that have been found, archaeologists tell us that whoever drew these drawings in the caves was trying to tell a story, was trying to tell us who they are. And so we have told stories since time immemorial, and we still tell stories. We tell stories because we don't want to believe that what is happening in the world around us are just a random sequence of events, that there is a pattern somewhere. You know, I remember reading a research study where the researchers presented to a classroom of university students certain geometrical patterns, you know, circles, squares, triangles, and so on. And they said, look, make sense of this. And every single student, except one, made a story out of those geometrical patterns. Because that's our technique to make sense of the world around us. And look, stories are also more memorable. You know, if I deliver a wise and I just presented some intellectual ideas without telling stories, by the time I'm finished, people have forgotten what I say. But if I tell stories, I can be quite sure that those stories will be remembered. And that's why stories have been the way in which we have transmitted tradition, we have transmitted values, transmitted our identity. And so I've tried to include three kinds of stories in the book. The first are obviously those that are connected with particular festivals. So the story of the sacrifice of Prophet Abraham and his son, it's connected to the Eid al-Adha. The story of Ghadir Khum is connected to Eid al-Ghadir and so on. So there are those stories. Then there are those stories that have come down to us in oral tradition. You know, those of us who remember the story that we used to tell as part of the Mola Jorojo Majlis, the Katyareji Varta, the woodcutter's tale. Now, you see, most of us might not know that this is actually a very popular tale from Iran. And so I've tried to capture those types of stories that are part of our heritage, that are part of our story, our identity, and these stories ought not to be forgotten. And the third kind of stories are stories from my own life, where I have certain interesting encounters, or I have learned certain lessons from certain episodes in my life. And I thought that that may be a way of sharing those lessons in a story form in the hopes that those lessons might be remembered.
Yes. And I suppose the difference between just giving a lecture and sharing knowledge through a story is it also engenders empathy in the listener. It's why we say if you reading fictional books, actually you get to know characters and you can imagine them and you use more parts of your body and your life experiences to understand. And so I suppose stories also create an emotional connection.
Yes, indeed.
And we are emotionally connected to these festivals, there's no doubt about it. But what's also curious about the festivals is no one of them goes by without poems or music associated with them. And you pepper your book very liberally with musical and poetic recitations. So you, clearly this was an important part of your cultural tradition.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us something about how that entered into your experiences?
So look, as you mentioned earlier, I grew up in Pakistan, and in Pakistani culture, we talk in verses, right? The poems of Iqbal and Ghalib and Rumi and others, that's how people communicate. I mean, those individuals who know me well, they know that sometimes when I want to communicate an idea, I will not articulate that thought in sentences. I will articulate that thought in verses. I will either cite a verse of Iqbal, or I will cite a verse from the Ginans. I mean, look, that's part of our tradition as well. Those of us from the South Asian tradition, we are told that you have a Ginanic worldview. That your worldview has emerged from the Ginans. And so, poetry has been part of our tradition, and that is also true for the Central Asian tradition, that is also true for the Syrian Arab tradition, and so on. And again, poetry is a way of communicating ideas that are often ineffable. Human language is designed to talk about things of this world. It is not designed to talk about the other world.
Transcendence, yes.
And so the only way you can talk about it is either in stories or in poetry.
Yes.
And we all know that when you put poetry to music, if it is in the form of a qawwali, for example, or a naat, or a hamd, or for that matter, ginans, it evokes a trance-like state. You know, in Sufi parlance, they call it masti. Not the masti of the Gujarati that we nowadays use, but that masti is a trance-like state, a euphoric, intoxicating state that is created. And it is not unusual for me, even now, when I'm alone to turn on a qawwali, because it evokes that trance-like state in me. And I wanted to try and communicate some of that through the poems, the songs that I have included in there, because I learned Islam through this poetry. I learned about my religion, my tradition, my heritage through songs and poems and stories, not by reading books. That came later. And so I wanted to share some of that with the Jamat as well, because I hope that that continues in our tradition.
Yes, but it's very clear, and certainly from my experiences, you can see the things that I have done have included a lot of music. I don't know that we could have expressed to the Imam of the time on his 80th birthday how much as a global Jamaat we loved and had gratitude for him and submitted to him in a way other than through music. And so we have a treat this evening, actually, because we have Inayat Haji and Saima Ali, who are going to share the first of 3 pieces of music with us that appear in the book. And the first one is a naat that is in the chapter on Milad al-Nabi and honoring the Prophet. Inayat and Saima.
Shahe Madina, Shahe Madina, Yasrab ke wali, sare nabi tere dar ki sawali. Shahe Madina, Shahe Madina. यसरब के वाली सारे नबी तेरे दर के सवाली शाहे मदीना शाहे मदीना
Thank you. So that was a naat in Urdu. I don't understand Urdu, but I think it's very hard not to be stirred, even when you don't understand the language itself. So in your book, after this naat, may I read from you?
Yes, certainly.
You wrote, "These are the words with which I was first introduced to the Prophet in my childhood, not as a historical figure who lived some 1400 years ago, but as the best of creation, the most honored among all the prophets, and the source of all beauty. He featured prominently in the prayers I learnt and the stories I heard. It was his example that was used to teach me what it meant to be good and virtuous. In times of happiness, it was his generosity and magnanimity that was remembered. And in difficult times, it was his patience and fortitude from which I was taught to seek solace. For as far back as I can remember, the Prophet has always been a living presence in my life, and I learnt to love him dearly. Over the years, as I read more about him, his life, teachings, and humanity, my devotion and affection for him has grown even stronger." So we feel very closely and deeply the relationship that you have with the Prophet today. And you go on to write about how shocked and hurt you were by the caricatures of the Prophet that were published in a Danish newspaper in 2005. And it's clear that you had to grapple with many issues at that time. Can you share with us how you negotiated those and how you reconciled yourself with the fact of these caricatures?
You know, one of the lines that Saima sang says that if it was not for you, this world would not have been created. That's what the Prophet is to us. He's the purpose of creation. And for a man like that to be reviled in that horrific way, insulted, caricatured, I was not just saddened, but I was actually angry. How could this be allowed in civilized society? You know, I believe in the freedom of speech. But how could the sentiments of millions, more than 1 billion Muslims, be allowed to be hurt in that way? And so I spoke to a couple of friends, scholars, of what they thought about it. One of them reminded me of a story from the life of the Prophet, the story of the Prophet's visit to the city of Taif. This was kind of a, you know, in historical sources, we know that there were only 2 occasions on which the Holy Prophet cried. One was when his young son passes away, Ibrahim. The only other occasion where he cries is after this visit to Taif. He had gone there seeking help because he had become stateless in some ways because his uncle passed away, his wife had passed away. And they not only rebuffed him, but they sent some of these ruffians and louts to chase him out. And they were throwing stones at him and his companion Zayd. And he was hit by so many stones and was bleeding. So much blood, sources tell us, he had shed that the soles of his feet got glued to his shoes. And when he was taking it out, he had to scrape it out. And that's when he cried, as to the pain, the suffering. Now, the sources tell us that 2 angels appeared to him, Jibreel and one other angel. And they say, God has seen what these people have done to you. And if you so wish, He will collapse them between these mountains. They will be buried in this valley. And the Prophet says, no, I have been sent as a mercy to mankind. How could I wish that on them? So He forgives them. And He says, I hope that someday believers will come from amongst them. And so this scholar friend was trying to tell me that, look, this is the approach. This is the Prophet's approach. Ignore them, forgive them. But this was not easy for me to do. Look, there are things in modern society, even in Western societies, we are not allowed to say. You know, until 2008 in England, there was a law against blasphemy, but it only covered Christianity. And now that law is gone as well. Why is it that there are certain things that you still can't say in this society? You know, anti-racist, racist speech is not allowed. Why is it that blasphemy is still permitted? This other scholar friend of mine told me is that who defines what is blasphemous? You know, when the last census was done in the UK, 390,000 people declared their religion as Jedi faith. You know what Jedis are, right? The Star Wars mythology. 390,000 so it's the 5th largest religion in UK. You laugh at it, but there are 20,000 Canadians who believe in this and 80,000 Australians who believe in this.
For our online audience.
Yeah. And they have developed a philosophy around this. It's like a Buddhist notion that they have developed around it. And so now, if you say something against Star Wars, you know, that's also blasphemy now. So how do you define this? One person's intellectual, ruminations might be blasphemous for somebody else. And when you start controlling these things, this scholar friend reminded me, well, where do you stop?
Yeah. It sounds very much like it's a negotiation between one person's rights and another person's rights.
Absolutely. And so, how did I reconcile myself? I found 2 verses in the Quran that I thought were helpful. In one verse, God says that when you hear people mocking my message, you know, in the time of the Prophet, there were people who used to mock the Prophet and his message. When you hear people mocking my message, walk away from there, God says. Just step away from there. Not permanently. God says that when they stop talking about you, stop mocking my message, you can come back and talk to them. So it's not kind of a permanent walking away. And so that was the first lesson, is just ignore it. The second lesson, which was much more consoling to me, God says in the Quran, he's referring to the people who are mocking the Prophet, that your God is sufficient for them. God says that, leave it to me. I'll deal with these guys.
Take care of it.
And so that's what I did. I left it. But it was a very hard thing to swallow. Very hard thing.
Because somebody that you love so dearly was being attacked.
I learned my faith through the Prophet's stories. I learned my faith through these songs. And he is our beloved, right? And in our love for the Prophet is our love for God. He is the mahbub of God. He's the beloved of God in Sufi parlance. And so that was a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah. I have to say that as a reader, I did feel your anguish, but it was also comforting for me in a way, because you were struggling with something, and not just here, but in other parts of the book, which really reflected how I struggle with my own kind of opinions and positions on things that are very important to me. So, you give space throughout the book for alternative points of view. So where we had, that animal sacrifices for Eid al-Adha, for example, you allow the voice of animal rights activists and for those who care about the environment to be heard in the debate as well. And I think what I'm left with is that it's okay for me not to be very clear about what my position is on something, that it's also okay for me to hold two conflicting positions on something that matters to me, and that it's okay to be in a constant state of negotiating my position. And so it was both comforting and actually gave me confidence that it was okay, I wasn't failing, I didn't have to have an answer, I could continue to inform myself. So I want to thank you for that as another gift that has come out of this book. So when we talk about those whom we love dearly, of course there's the Prophet and then there's Imam Ali. And in your chapter on Yom Ali, you touch on a deeper understanding of the Aliyat tradition. And you talk about how broad a tradition it is. Now, many of us will say the Aliyat tradition must be a Shia tradition, but in fact you debunk that and you make it very clear that the Aliyat tradition is a much broader Muslim tradition. And what happens, I think, is that you expose the fallacy that there is this very strict Shia-Sunni divide that has been forever thus, and help us to recognize that actually it's a contemporary geopolitical construct. But I think it would be really interesting for us to understand from you now the bit of a context of the Aliyat tradition and how it relates to Yom Ali for us.
So look, we all know that Mawla Ali is revered by all Muslims. I tell the story, for example, in the book about a Sunni imam visiting this Ismaili Centre. And at that time, I happened to be the vice president of the council. And I was giving him a tour. And he would always refer to Hazrat Ali as Mawla Ali. He's a Sunni imam. You know, Mawla means my Lord, my master. And this is a recognition of the Prophet's hadith at Ghadir Khum, right? Man kuntu mawlahu fa'aliyun mawlahu. And so many Muslims refer to Hazrat Ali as Mawla Ali with great reverence. He's, of course, also recognized as the fourth of the Khulafai Rashidun, as they are called, the rightly guided caliphs. Only four. Hazrat Ali is part of that. You know, a Sunni Imam, Ahmad ibn Hanbal. By the way, you know, we talk about the Wahhabis, you know, and the Muslims in Saudi Arabia. They follow the teachings of Ahmad ibn Hanbal and then others as well. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal says in his Masnad that for no other companion of the Prophet has the Prophet articulated the virtues that he has ascribed to Hazrat Ali. So he's a revered figure in that sense. But more than that, you see, you spoke of the Aliyat tradition. What is the Aliyat tradition? Well, the Aliyat tradition includes the ideas that the Prophet left behind Hazrat Ali as his successor. It speaks of the idea that Mullah Murtaza Ali is our spiritual master. It speaks of the idea that Hazrat Ali had special wisdom. Well, the vast majority of Sufis in the world, who are mostly Sunnis, well, they see Mullah Murtaza Ali as their Mawla, successor to the Prophet, after, you know, he's the Mawla of the believers, as their spiritual master, because most of these chains of the sheikhs, they all connect to the Prophet. But the person who connects them to the Prophet, for all major Sufi communities except one, I think it's the Naqshbandiya, the person who connects them to the Prophet is Mullah Murtaza Ali. He's their qutb, around which the whole tariqah revolves. They accept and recognize that Mullah Murtaza Ali had special wisdom given to him by the Holy Prophet. How is that not the Aliyat tradition? And so when we speak of the Aliyat tradition, I don't think we should limit it just to the large communities of the Shia, the Isna Sharis, the Ismailis, the Zaydis. But all of those who revere Mullah Murtaza Ali in this way are indeed part of the Aliyat tradition. And that's what I've tried to capture in the book.
Yeah. So Imam Ali, Mawla Ali, forms a very significant part of Muslim identity.
Absolutely.
Yes. And to such an extent, in fact, that movies include soundtracks about him. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so you have included that in your book. I know I sort of heard a murmur in the room because it's quite surprising. So we're going to invite Inayat and Saima again to sing a song from a film made in 1957 called Sher-e-Baghdad, in which Mola Ali is portrayed as Mushkil Kusha.
शाहे मर्दा शेर यज़दा कुव्वते परवरदिगार लाफता इल्ला अली ला सैफ इल्ला जुल्फ़िकार मौला अली शेर खुदा मेरी कश्ती पार लगा दे ना हसनैन का सदका मौला अली ओ मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना ऐ मौला अली ऐ शेर खुदा मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना तुमने सुनी फरियाद सभी की तुम इक़्तद की बंदों की अब मेरी भी सुन लो बहर खुदा हो अब मेरी भी सुन लो बहर खुदा मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना ऐ मौला अली ऐ शेर खुदा मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना जान बड़ी मुश्किल में पड़ी है आओ मदद को शेर खुदा कहते हैं तुम्हें सब मुश्किल कुशा हो कहते हैं तुम्हें सब मुश्किल कुशा मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना ऐ मौला अली ऐ शेर खुदा मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना मेरी कश्ती पार लगा देना याली 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 याली
Thank you. So, in this chapter on Yom Ali, and in the story of Mushkil Kusha, I learnt the origins of the Nadi Ali prayer. And we're not going to share that with the audience today because they can read the book to find out. But what it did for me was to make me reconsider the power of this prayer. And that nugget, amongst several others, you pepper through the book, are other gifts that you give us in ways in which we can relate to our faith and the practice of our faith and the celebration of our festivals. So Ali, we have established, is revered throughout the Ummah. But when you were growing up, and indeed even today, the school curriculum omits the story of Gadir-e-Kum. And when you were learning at school, this had a profound impact on your sense of self, because something that you had imagined was so fundamental to history had been written out in the school curriculum. Can you tell us what happened and what you did?
So I tell this story in the book about my studies in Pakistan. In Pakistan, still today, there is a subject, if you're a Muslim, there is a subject that you have to take called Islamiyat. And in that Islamiyat, you're taught parts of the Quran, about the history of Islam, the history of the Prophet, and so on. And so I must have been in the 7th grade, if I recall. The story of the Prophet was told. And when they got to the Hajjatul Wada, the last pilgrimage of the Prophet, and then the Prophet came back to Mecca. And Gadir Qawm was not mentioned. Now, as a child, you don't have those inhibitions. And so I raised my hand and I asked I actually remember my question. I just said to the teacher, what happened to Gadir Qawm? Because I had learned that in my Baitul Ilm classes, yes, what we used to call night classes. And the teacher said that, this is a made-up story. And she was a bit irritated that I was questioning this. She said, look, it's not in the book, and so we're not going to talk about that. And that, it was a kind of a shock because I was learning about the history of a particular period, and I was learning two different histories. Yes. As a child, you can't reconcile that. I mean, you think of history as just a sequence of events. And so I went and talked to my Baitul Ilm teachers, and they said, look, don't worry about it, and he showed me some source, and he said that, here is Gadir Qawm. And so I took that, reference to my teacher the next time I met her, and I said that, you said it's not in the books, here it is. And she kind of poo-pooed that source because she said this is a very late source, and she pulled out the Seerah of the Prophet, which is the earliest biography of the Prophet. And she opened that
This
page.
was your Baitul Ilm teacher?
No, this is my secular school teacher, Islamia teacher. She opened it and she says, show me where is Gadir Qawm. And it was in Urdu, I remember that. And so I read parts of it, and sure enough, the Gadir Qawm wasn't there. I was stumped. Later I found out that, this Ahmad ibn Hanbal that I have mentioned earlier, in his Masnad, the Gadir Qawm event and the hadith is there. But the fact that my history as a Shia, as an Ismaili, was absent from the sources. The fact that when Islam was being taught, Ismailis were not even a footnote out there. I mean, let alone a mention. We weren't even a footnote in there. It made me at that time question my Muslimness. How Muslim am I? Where my history, my understanding of the Prophet and his legacy, it does not matter to anybody. I found that quite difficult at that time. And I suspect that there are Muslim students, Shia Muslim students, members of our Jamat, who still struggle with that. And so I think the fact that we have now a religious education program that completes that picture, because what you're getting is one half of the picture in some of these secular school programs, that at least our religious education program helps us complete the picture. Because it's an important part of our identity.
Yeah. And that's a big shout out for Tariqa Board, ITREBs around the world, secondary curriculum. Please read, please share with your children. There is something, though, about the importance of writing our history. And we can see now how, when IIS was established, it was one of its missions was to ensure that we were never again written out of history. And I suppose I have to submit that I now understand why this book has come out of IIS, because it is a reflection of our history and a living tradition. So very much a part of the IIS mission. So you have just explained to us where you got your religious education from. But as you speak about your childhood, the book heavily references the impact that your family had on you, particularly your father. And we see that actually your religious formation, the basis on which, where you got your moral compass and your values and your identity, came from their example, from participating in community activities with them, from discussions, from storytelling. And you say that your parents took the guidance of the Imam of the time very seriously. How did that actually play out for you in how you were growing up? What were your observations around where the guidance of the Imam actually had an impact on your life?
So look, like any young child, I used to chaff at the fact that my parents were so aggressive about making sure that you had the best grades and making sure that you went to the best schools, making sure you didn't waste your time, that you spent all your time learning, as much of your time learning as possible. My dad used to, for example, get very irritated with me when I would spend time listening to songs, but never read. I don't ever remember my parents saying to me that you should do this because Hazrat Imam says so. But somehow, they had internalized some of this direction of the Imam, that look, this is the only time in your life where you can get your education, and you should get the best of education. Look after your health, and so on. And this was not just my family. I mean, this is the vast majority of families that I recall. And even today, parents do that, right? It's only now that I can make that connection between those decisions that my parents were making, the sacrifices that the parents were making, and the guidance of the Imam. And I have this deep fear that in our times, I suspect that many young people can't make that connection. We might risk, I think there's a risk that we might take our Imam's guidance for granted. I had a very disturbing experience once meeting with a young person in Canada. I delivered a wise in Jamat Khana. He met me after, and he said, look, all these things that you say is fine, but what has the Imam done for me?
Yes.
And that's what I mean, that we think that if we have achieved what we have achieved as a community, as individuals, as families, that we have achieved it by the dint of our own efforts. But I think if we think carefully about it, we will realize that if we have become what we have become, the way we have learned to think is greatly due to the teachings of our Imams. Look, there are communities like ours who have pretty much the same history as our community. But look at how they think. And look at where we are. Look at where we as a community, we punch way above our weight. Why? How? It has to do with the teachings of our Imams. And I was concerned that this sentiment, this idea, this recognition might get lost. And so that's why I included those ideas in the book as a way of making connections between the teachings of the Imam and how we behave in our everyday lives in our Jamaat. In the hopes that people who read this will make those connections. Young people particularly who read this, inshallah, will make those connections.
Will make those connections. Well, certainly the two festivals which are cherished by Ismailis exclusively are Salgira and Imamah Day. And they are the festivals that really have us focus on the Imam of the time. I suppose what they help us to do is to recognize that we have an ever-present, ever-living Imam, given what they celebrate. And as Ismailis, we are united by our bay'ah, the bay'ah that we are, the pledge of allegiance that we give to the Imam of the time. And in that capacity, surely it is every murid's desire to have a visit from the Imam of the time. And in your book, you include a Geet a Gujarati Geet, which is associated with Dandiya Ras and Ras Garba, which is a heartfelt invitation to the Imam. And we'll ask Inayat and Saima for the last time this evening, please, to share your music.
जमातो दीदार दियो वाट जुए चे जमातो दीदार दियो ओ नैनो ना तारा पाओ करीम शाह प्यारा आवो तो दूध ना प्याला पिवराविए उना उना रोटला ने माखन खवराविए आवो तो दूध ना प्याला पिवराविए उना उना रोटला ने माखन खवराविए की मानी तरता भोजन जमारिए मधुरस मेवानी लानी कराविए की मानी तरता भोजन जमारिए मधुरस मेवानी लानी कराविए ओ आँखों मदये उतारा आवो करीम शाह प्यारा एक बार मारे कमरे आवो एक बार मारे कमरे आवो ओ सिर ताज हमारा आवो करीम शाह प्यारा
I was plunged back into my childhood of dancing and eating and laughing and joy and celebration and the music what that music evoked for me. Why do we celebrate?
You know, until a few years ago, I used to actually quibble with Jamati leadership every time I went to one of these celebrations, because I thought that, this is all secular.
There's a lot of fun there, Shiraz.
I used to complain to say that, look, where is the religiosity in here? This is a religious festival. But I realized that I was looking past something, that in the joy that the Jamaat is expressing, in this confidence that the Jamaat is expressing through its celebrations, in this unity that the Jamaat is demonstrating through these celebrations, that is a proxy for gratitude and recognition for the Imam's guidance. We are who we are as a community if we have the kind of pride, the kind of confidence, the kind of success that we have, by demonstrating that in festivities. We are acknowledging the imamat of the Imam. And I was missing that point. And there is another poem that I've included in there, which is the old Gujarati poem, Khoja uthao boja kahi, khojao ne sambodhita, gor kabrastan wa khojao jain ne khodita. That's who we were in the South Asian Ismaili community. Ismailis were the ones who used to go dig graves, and they were beasts of burden, so to speak. From there, within a century, the Imams have brought us where we are today. And so it's important that these celebrations are the way they are. And so that's what we celebrate, the joy of having a living Imam in our lives, an Imam whose guidance has been so prescient, so ahead of his times, that it has allowed us to prepare for the challenges that we will face in the future, which is why the community has become what it has become. So that's my view of why we celebrate.
Yes, and it's a book that is stories of celebration.
It is, yes.
So I'd like to thank those of you who have joined us from 18 countries. We have been joined, including Tanzania, Bahrain, Switzerland, India, Pakistan, France, Hong Kong, Mauritius, Portugal. I won't list them all. On that note, on behalf of all of us here, we'd like to thank you, Dr. Kabani, for your 40 years of storytelling, which you have succinctly captured in this book. It's a real gift to us as a community. I'm sure it will form the beginning of a fantastic living tradition series, a springboard for other books to come, and also we will surely look back on this in 40 years' time and reflect on how our children were experiencing their festivals today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rehan?
Thank you, Shiraz and Nina, for a delightful and colorful discussion of the book. Shiraz, I'm looking forward to getting my copy of the book signed this evening. Ismaili Festivals, Stories of Celebration, is available now at your local ITREB. I would like to now introduce Nimit Hirji, the Executive Officer of ITREB UK, to close today's session with a vote of thanks.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It is my honor to offer a few thank yous before we close this evening. Firstly, Shiraz. Tonight you've not only helped us to deepen our understanding of the meaning and richness behind our traditions and festivals, but actually brought them to life through your personal stories. Nina, your insights drew out aspects in the conversation that many of us otherwise would never really have seen. Our collective gratitude to both of you. To Inayat and Saima, our singers, all I can say is, what beautiful voices. Many volunteers have helped to make this evening possible. If we can please take a moment to acknowledge them, including all our technical teams here and at Ismaili TV. Not to forget each of you who have joined us either here at the Ismaili Centre, London, or virtually on Ismaili TV. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Stay safe, Ya Ali Madad, and Khuda Hafiz.